Having reviewed the findings of the jury, this court has reached its decision. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison.
On Halloween night, October 31st, 2024, in Miami, Florida, 14-year-old Theo Robertson brutally attacked and killed the Harris family, Kevin, Jessica, and their 8-year-old son, Mason, as they unloaded Halloween decorations from their SUV in their driveway. The teenager emerged from the shadows wearing a plastic skeleton mask and wielding a metal pipe, striking each family member repeatedly with such force that all three were pronounced dead at the scene. Blood spattered across the family's pristine white garage door, and the half-unloaded boxes of cheerful Halloween decorations created a macabre tableau that would haunt first responders for years to come. Neighbors reported hearing screams that they initially mistook for Halloween revelry until they saw Theo fleeing down the street, still clutching the bloodied metal pipe. Before we continue with this horrifying case, I'd love to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support helps us bring more of these detailed true crime analyses to light, examining the psychological factors that lead to such devastating acts of violence. The attack occurred in Coconut Grove, an affluent Miami neighborhood known for its lush landscapes and family-friendly atmosphere, making the brutal nature of the crime all the more shocking to the community. Security footage from a neighboring house captured Theo lurking behind palm trees for nearly 40 minutes, watching the Harris family's car pull into the driveway before making his move. The teenager waited until Kevin Harris had his back turned, unloading a box of decorative pumpkins from the trunk, before approaching swiftly and silently across the manicured lawn. The first blow caught Kevin Harris on the back of the skull, and the emergency room doctor who later examined the body would testify that he likely died instantly, never even seeing his attacker. Jessica Harris had been arranging a plastic skeleton on the front lawn when she heard the sickening crack of metal against her husband's skull and turned to witness his body crumpling to the ground. Neighbors 3 houses down reported hearing her screams as she frantically tried to reach her son, who was removing a ghost decoration from the back seat of the SUV. Security footage shows Jessica running toward the vehicle, arms outstretched toward her child, before Theo intercepted her, swinging the pipe with both hands in a motion one detective would later compare to a baseball player hitting a home run. The blow connected with the side of her head with such force that Jessica was lifted off her feet before falling to the concrete driveway, where Theo continued to strike her repeatedly even after she had stopped moving. Young Mason Harris, still holding the ghost decoration, froze in terror as he witnessed the attack on his mother from inside the vehicle. The boy attempted to lock himself in the car, but in his panic was unable to engage the electronic locks before Theo wrenched open the door. Mason's small backpack filled with Halloween candy he had received earlier that evening at a school party was found spilled across the back seat, colorful wrappers mingling with blood spatter. Forensic analysis would later determine that despite his young age, Mason had attempted to fight back, evidenced by defensive wounds on his arms and Theo's skin cells found under his fingernails. The entire attack lasted less than 4 minutes but resulted in catastrophic violence that transformed a scene of holiday preparation into one of unspeakable carnage. Blood evidence suggested that Theo continued to strike each victim well after they had died, indicating a level of rage that shocked even veteran Miami homicide detectives. The pipe, a 3-foot length of galvanized steel commonly used in plumbing, had been reported stolen from a construction site 2 blocks away earlier that day. When police later recovered the weapon from bushes near the scene, they discovered it was bent from the force with which Theo had wielded it against his victims. Miami's balmy evening air, typically filled with the scents of tropical flowers and ocean breezes, that night carried the metallic smell of blood and the sharp tang of fear through the neighborhood. Halloween decorations throughout the area, smiling jack-o'-lanterns, playful ghosts, and plastic tombstones, took on a grotesque quality in the aftermath of real death visiting the community. Children in costumes and their parents were redirected away from the crime scene by police officers, many of whom struggled to maintain their composure as they established a perimeter around the Harris home. The flashing lights of police cruisers and ambulances reflected off the windows of surrounding houses, creating a pulsing, disorienting effect that matched the community's collective sense of disbelief. As forensic teams worked methodically through the night, the bodies of the Harris family remained where they had fallen, covered with white sheets that billowed occasionally in the warm Florida breeze. Crime scene technicians carefully documented and photographed every aspect of the scene, their camera flashes adding to the surreal atmosphere. The metal pipe, found partially concealed in an ornamental hedge approximately 50 yards from the driveway, quickly became the investigation's most crucial piece of physical evidence. The killer had attempted to wipe it clean before discarding it, but had succeeded only in smearing the blood rather than removing his fingerprints from the handle. The residents of Coconut Grove, many still in Halloween costumes, gathered behind the police tape, their faces masks of horror that rivaled their festive disguises. Parents hugged their children close, suddenly acutely aware of how quickly safety could transform into danger, how thin the membrane was between celebration and tragedy. Local news crews arrived within 30 minutes, their satellite trucks and bright lights adding to the carnival-like atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the grim reality of what had occurred. The tropical Miami night, normally alive with music and laughter on Halloween, instead echoed with sirens and sobbing as the community began to process the shock of having a monster in their midst. Not the plastic pretend kind they had prepared for, but a real one who had walked among them unrecognized. Miami-Dade Police Detective Gabriel Martin arrived at the scene at 9:47 p.m., just 23 minutes after the first 911 call. A 20-year veteran of the force who had worked some of Miami's most notorious cases, Martin would later tell reporters that he had never seen such extreme violence directed at a child. The detective noticed immediately that the attack did not fit the pattern of Miami's usual homicides. There were no signs of robbery, no indications of a drug connection, and the neighborhood had no history of gang activity. The brutality suggested a personal connection, yet interviews with neighbors and initial background checks on the Harris family revealed no obvious enemies or recent conflicts. By midnight, as trick-or-treaters across Miami returned home to count their candy, the technical team had successfully lifted several clear fingerprints from the metal pipe. Detective Martin, standing under the royal palms that lined the Harris driveway, made the decision to expedite the fingerprint analysis, sensing that the killer might strike again if driven by the same unidentified rage that had fueled this attack. The prints were immediately sent to the Miami-Dade Crime Lab with the highest priority designation, bypassing dozens of other cases awaiting processing. Martin remained at the scene until 4 a.m., walking the perimeter repeatedly, as if the tropical shadows might yield additional clues if he looked hard enough. Kevin Harris, 42, had built a stellar reputation as one of Miami's most beloved pediatricians, known for his gentle manner with frightened children and his willingness to accept patients regardless of their insurance status. He had grown up in modest circumstances in Central Florida, the son of a mechanic and a school cafeteria worker, and had worked his way through medical school at the University of Miami, often studying by flashlight in his small apartment when he couldn't afford to pay the electric bill. Friends described him as someone who never forgot his humble beginnings, who drove the same sensible sedan for 10 years despite his success, and who volunteered 1 weekend a month at a free clinic in Little Havana. His colleagues at Miami Children's Hospital had planned a surprise party for the following week to celebrate his receiving a humanitarian award from the Florida Medical Association for his work with underserved communities. Jessica Harris, 39, had taught third grade at Coconut Grove Elementary for 11 years, where she was renowned for transforming her classroom into magical environments that made learning an adventure for her students. Each year, she spent hundreds of dollars of her own money on classroom supplies, created individualized learning plans for struggling students, and stayed late to help parents understand how best to support their children's education. Born and raised in Miami to Cuban immigrant parents, she was fluently bilingual and often served as a bridge between the school and Spanish-speaking families, translating documents and facilitating parent-teacher conferences with a warmth that made everyone feel welcome. The bulletin board outside her classroom still displayed her students' Halloween art projects, paper pumpkins with wobbly handwritten stories about what scared them, now hanging like poignant memorials to a teacher who had taught them not to be afraid. Mason Harris, only 8 years old, had inherited his father's compassionate nature and his mother's creative spirit, combining them into a personality that charmed everyone he met. His soccer coach described him as the kind of child who would pass the ball to less skilled players so they could experience the joy of scoring, while his science teacher noted his insatiable curiosity about the natural world, particularly marine biology inspired by Miami's coastal location. Mason had dressed as a marine biologist for Career Day, complete with a small lab coat his mother had sewn from an old sheet, and had announced to his classmates that he was going to discover a new species of dolphin one day and name it after his parents. In his desk at school, police found a half-finished letter to Santa Claus, dated 3 days before his death, asking not for toys, but for a special science kit and maybe something nice for Mom and Dad because they work really hard. The Harris family home in Coconut Grove reflected their values, modest but welcoming, filled with books, children's artwork, and framed family photographs documenting their life together. The kitchen calendar was packed with community commitments, Kevin's clinic volunteer days, Jessica's school events, Mason's soccer practices, and family time blocked out in bold letters every Sunday. Neighbors recalled how the family had transformed their backyard into a community gathering space, hosting movie nights where neighborhood children would spread blankets on the grass and watch films projected against the side of the garage. The refrigerator door, photographed by crime scene technicians, was covered with Mason's artwork, his school papers with bright red A's, and a family vacation photo from the Florida Keys showing all three with sunburned noses and wide smiles as they held up a small fish Mason had caught. In the humid Miami autumn, the Harris family had become known for their elaborate Halloween decorations, which Jessica had begun planning in August each year. Kevin would spend weekends in October constructing handmade props, friendly ghosts that waved in the breeze, motion-activated talking pumpkins that complimented children on their costumes, and a candy chute he had designed so that trick-or-treaters with mobility issues could easily receive treats. Mason had taken particular pride in creating the spooky but not too scary atmosphere, insisting that decorations be fun rather than frightening so that younger children wouldn't be afraid to approach the house. This year, he had saved his allowance to buy special color-changing lights that would illuminate the family's collection of inflatable Halloween characters, a purchase his parents had driven him to make just hours before their deaths. The Harris family's prominence in the community meant that news of their murders spread rapidly through Miami, leaving a wake of shocked disbelief. Kevin's patients and their parents gathered outside his medical practice, creating a memorial of stuffed animals, children's drawings, and candles that spilled from the sidewalk onto the street. Jessica's third-grade students, too young to fully comprehend what had happened, were told simply that their teacher had gone to heaven, but many intuitively understood the gravity of the situation and sobbed inconsolably at their desks. the school principal described the impossible task of comforting 38-year-olds who kept asking when Ms. Harris would return, their small faces crumpling when given evasive answers. The murder of a child always affects a community profoundly, but Mason's death created a particular kind of collective grief in Miami. His soccer teammates wore black armbands at their next game and left an empty space in their lineup where he would have played, passing the ball to that empty space in a poignant tribute that left spectators in tears. His pediatrician, ironically a colleague of his father's, reported that many children who had known Mason were now experiencing nightmares, separation anxiety, and fears about their own safety. Miami Children's Hospital established a grief counseling center specifically to help young patients process the loss, with child psychologists volunteering their time to support families struggling to explain the inexplicable to their children. The tropical Miami heat seemed especially oppressive in the days following the murders, as if the city itself were feverish with grief. The medical examiner's office worked efficiently but respectfully to complete the autopsies, confirming what was already apparent. All 3 Harris family members had died from blunt force trauma delivered with extreme violence. Kevin had suffered a single devastating blow to the back of the head, while Jessica and Mason had received multiple strikes, indicating they had been alive and possibly conscious for the initial attacks. The medical examiner, a veteran of dozens of homicide cases, requested a mental health day after completing Mason's autopsy, an unprecedented action that spoke volumes about the emotional toll the case was taking even on seasoned professionals. The funeral service for the Harris family was held at the largest church in Coconut Grove, but still could not accommodate all who wished to attend. The overflow crowd stood quietly in the church parking lot under Miami's punishing sun, listening to the service broadcast through speakers hastily set up by the church's technical team. 3 caskets, one heartbreakingly small, sat at the front of the church, surrounded by Kevin's favorite books, Jessica's classroom reading chair, and Mason's soccer ball and marine biology guides. The pastor, struggling to maintain his composure, spoke of lives well lived rather than deaths tragically experienced, but even his practiced professional demeanor cracked when describing the family's last day together, how they had carved pumpkins in the morning, attended Mason's school Halloween parade at lunch, and purchased his special lights on their way home. In the aftermath of the murders, the community searched for meaning in a seemingly senseless act of violence. Interviews with those who knew the Harris family revealed no obvious reasons why anyone would target them specifically. They had no known enemies, no significant conflicts with neighbors, and no connections to any criminal activity. Detective Gabriel Martin noted in his initial report that the random nature of the attack was perhaps its most disturbing aspect, suggesting that the Harris family might simply have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or worse, selected for reasons that existed solely in their killer's mind. This randomness heightened the community's fear, as Miami residents realized that the victims had done nothing to deserve their fate. They had simply been living their lives, celebrating a holiday, being a family. The 911 call that alerted police to the Harris family murders came from Eleanor Winters, a 78-year-old retired librarian who lived directly across the street and had been handing out candy on her porch when she heard Jessica Harris's screams. "There's someone attacking the Harris family in their driveway," she told the dispatcher in a voice that remained remarkably steady despite her age and the horror she was witnessing. "A person in a skeleton mask is hitting them with some kind of pipe or bat. Oh God, he's going after their little boy now." The dispatcher kept Mrs. Winters on the line as police units were dispatched, the elderly woman's breathing becoming increasingly labored as she described the attacker fleeing the scene, running past her house, and disappearing down the street into the warm Miami night. Detective Gabriel Martin arrived to find a scene that looked like a Hollywood set designer's macabre vision of horror, the festive Halloween decorations creating a grotesque contrast with the 3 covered bodies lying in the Harris family's driveway. The detective's first action was to establish a perimeter around the crime scene, extending it to include the surrounding blocks where the killer might have discarded evidence while fleeing. "Search every hedge, every storm drain, every trash can," he instructed the uniformed officers, his instincts telling him that the murder weapon would likely be found nearby. Martin's hunch proved correct when Officer Daniela Suarez radioed in less than 30 minutes later, reporting that she had discovered a metal pipe partially concealed in a hibiscus hedge approximately 50 yards from the crime scene. The tropical plant's bright red flowers now spattered with darker red stains. The metal pipe was retrieved using proper evidence collection protocols and immediately identified as the likely murder weapon based on the visible blood spatter and hair consistent with the victims. Under the bright crime scene lights, technician Tyler Rogers noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Despite the blood, an apparent attempt to wipe the weapon clean, there appeared to be several clear fingerprints preserved on the handle. The perpetrator likely thought the blood would obscure any prints, but the opposite happened, Rogers would later testify. The blood acted as a contrast medium against the metal surface, actually making the ridge patterns more distinct in several areas where pressure was applied during the attack. The fingerprints were photographed in place, then carefully lifted, and rushed to the Miami-Dade Crime Lab, where analyst Sophia Chen began processing them immediately, despite the late hour. The tropical heat of Miami created additional challenges for evidence preservation, with the humidity threatening to compromise biological samples if not properly handled. Chen worked methodically through the night in the air-conditioned lab, first analyzing the prints using the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFIS, to search for matches in the Adult Criminal Database, which returned no results. She then expanded the search to include juvenile records, a step that would prove crucial to breaking the case open. As the fingerprint analysis was underway, other members of the investigation team fanned out through the Coconut Grove neighborhood, conducting interviews with potential witnesses. The timing of the murders, Halloween night, meant that numerous people had been outside, either trick-or-treating with children or distributing candy from their homes. Despite the neighborhood's wealthy status and its reputation for privacy, the holiday had created an unusual situation where many residents had witnessed at least portions of the suspect's movements before or after the crime. Mrs. Winter's description of the attacker was supplemented by accounts from several other neighbors, creating a consistent image of a relatively small person in a plastic skeleton mask and dark clothing who had been seen walking through the area for at least an hour before the attack. Security camera footage proved to be a critical resource in the investigation, with Miami's affluent Coconut Grove neighborhood having one of the highest concentrations of private security systems in the city. Detective Martin obtained warrants for footage from cameras on 12 different properties surrounding the Harris home, creating a patchwork of surveillance that allowed the team to track the suspect's movements with surprising clarity. The footage showed the suspect arriving in the neighborhood approximately 90 minutes before the attack, moving with purpose rather than wandering, suggesting premeditation rather than a random crime of opportunity. Several cameras captured clear images of the suspect watching families trick-or-treating, standing motionless in shadows for extended periods before following the Harris family home. The forensic team worked through the night processing the crime scene, collecting blood samples, fiber evidence, and casting footprints found in the soft soil of the garden beds flanking the Harris driveway. The humid Miami air made evidence collection particularly challenging, with technicians working under bright lights that attracted swarms of insects typical to the region. Detective Martin remained on site, coordinating the investigation, his normally immaculate appearance gradually yielding to the effects of the tropical climate and the grueling nature of the case. By dawn, when the bodies were finally removed from the scene, Martin's white shirt was soaked with sweat, his face drawn with fatigue and the emotional weight of what he had witnessed. At 6:43 a.m. on November 1st, as Miami began to wake to the news of the murders that had occurred in one of its most prestigious neighborhoods, Sophia Chen contacted Detective Martin with preliminary results from the fingerprint analysis. "The prints from the pipe match a juvenile in the system," she reported, her voice betraying her surprise. One Theo Robertson, white male, age 14, with a prior arrest for vandalism 8 months ago. The detective, who had been expecting the perpetrator to be an adult with a substantial criminal history given the extreme violence of the crime, was momentarily silent as he processed this information. When he finally responded, his question was simple. "Are you certain about this match?" Chen's confidence in the fingerprint identification was absolute, the match having returned a 12-point correspondence that far exceeded the threshold required for legal identification. The system had flagged Theo's prints because he had been arrested the previous February for vandalizing public property at a Miami park, specifically for breaking lights along a walking path. That case had been adjudicated in juvenile court, resulting in community service hours and mandatory counseling rather than detention, explaining why the teenager was free on Halloween night. Martin immediately dispatched officers to the address listed in Theo's file, only to discover it was outdated. The foster home where he had been living at the time of his previous arrest had since closed, and Theo had been relocated within the system. The investigation now faced a critical challenge, locating a potentially dangerous suspect whose current whereabouts were unknown while preventing public panic in a city already on edge. Martin contacted the Florida Department of Children and Families to obtain Theo's current placement information, encountering the bureaucratic delays that often plague such systems. While waiting for this information, the detective made the strategic decision to withhold the suspect's identity from the press conference scheduled for that morning, announcing only that they had recovered the murder weapon with viable fingerprint evidence and were pursuing strong leads. Miami residents, accustomed to crime reports being a regular feature of local news, were nevertheless shocked by the brutality of this particular case, especially given its timing on Halloween and the involvement of a child victim. The Miami Sun beat down relentlessly as the investigation continued throughout November 1st, the city's famous beaches and tourist attractions operating as normal, while a different reality unfolded in the air-conditioned offices of the Miami-Dade Police Department. By mid-afternoon, the department had received Theo's current address, a foster home in Little Haiti, a predominantly Caribbean neighborhood approximately 4 miles from the crime scene. Rather than immediately descending on the location, Martin chose a more measured approach, establishing surveillance on the home while gathering additional information about its occupants, particularly concerned about the presence of other foster children who might be at risk or who might be traumatized by a dramatic police action. The foster home where Theo resided was operated by Raymond and Anita Powell, a couple in their 50s who had been fostering children for over 15 years and currently had 4 foster children in their care, including Theo. The Powells had an excellent reputation within the system, known for providing a stable environment for children who had experienced significant trauma and had no history of complaints or incidents at their home. This positive background added another layer of complexity to the case, as it seemed incongruous that a child from such a placement would commit a crime of this nature. Detective Martin decided to approach the situation with caution, planning to arrive at the foster home early the following morning when all residents would likely be present, but before Theo would leave for school. As night fell on Miami once again, the investigation had developed with remarkable speed, progressing from a shocking crime scene to the identification of a specific suspect in less than 24 hours. The tropical city's nightlife continued unabated along Ocean Drive, and in the clubs of South Beach, the neon lights and pulsing music creating a surreal counterpoint to the grim work being done by the investigation team. Detective Martin finally returned to his apartment near Biscayne Bay at midnight, standing on his balcony in the warm night air as he mentally prepared for the arrest operation planned for the following morning. The city lights reflected on the dark water of the bay, beautiful and indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded beneath them. The fingerprint match to 14-year-old Theo Robertson sent shockwaves through the Miami-Dade Police Department, challenging the investigators' initial assumptions about the type of person capable of such extreme violence. Detective Gabriel Martin, who had spent 2 decades working homicide cases in Miami, had seen the aftermath of crimes committed by juveniles before, but never anything approaching this level of brutality from someone so young. "We need to be absolutely certain about this identification," he told his team during a briefing at headquarters, his voice grave as the early morning sunlight streamed through the blinds. "Double-check the prints, triple-check them if necessary, because what we're suggesting is that a 14-year-old child committed one of the most violent murders this city has seen in years." Forensic analyst Sophia Chen stood by her identification with complete confidence, presenting the side-by-side comparison of the prints found on the metal pipe with those taken from Theo during his previous arrest. The match was undeniable, with 12 distinct points of correspondence clearly visible even to the untrained observers in the room. The prints on the murder weapon belonged to Theo Robertson without any doubt, Chen stated firmly, her professionalism momentarily giving way to emotion, as she added, "I double and triple-checked because I couldn't believe a child could do this either." The clarity of the prints was exceptional, preserved in blood on the metal surface, in a way that provided forensic evidence far stronger than typically found at crime scenes, especially those involving blunt force trauma weapons that are often wiped clean in the commission of the crime. The investigation team's focus now shifted to understanding how a 14-year-old foster child with only a minor previous offense had escalated to such extreme violence. Martin assigned Detective Alicia Patel to dive into Theo's background while he personally led the planned arrest operation. Patel began by accessing Theo's juvenile record, which contained details of his February arrest for vandalizing park lights in a wealthy neighborhood near Biscayne Bay. The arrest report painted a picture of a troubled but not violent youth who had been caught breaking decorative pathway lights with rocks, causing several $1,000s in damage, but no threat to human safety. Deeper investigation revealed that Theo had been in Florida's foster care system since the age of 9. When his mother, a single parent with severe substance abuse issues, had abandoned him in their apartment for several days while on a drug binge. In the 5 years since entering the system, Theo had been placed in 7 different foster homes across Miami-Dade County, moving frequently due to foster parents requesting his removal, citing his withdrawal, occasional outbursts of anger, and difficulty bonding with other family members. Despite these behavioral issues, none of his previous placements had reported any violent tendencies, and his school records showed average academic performance with poor attendance, but no history of fighting or aggression toward other students or teachers. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Miami sky, bringing with it the characteristic humidity that would make the day increasingly uncomfortable, Detective Martin and a team of 4 officers approached the Powell Foster Home in Little Haiti. The neighborhood, known for its vibrant Caribbean culture, colorful murals, and small Creole-speaking businesses, was beginning its daily routine as the unmarked police vehicles parked a block away from their target. Martin had deliberately chosen not to arrive with lights and sirens preferring a more discreet approach that would minimize trauma to the other children in the home and reduce the risk of Theo attempting to flee or, worse, harming someone if cornered dramatically. The Powell home was a modest one-story structure, painted a pale yellow with white trim, well-maintained but showing signs of age typical to the neighborhood. A small garden of tropical plants flanked the concrete walkway leading to the front door, and children's bicycles were neatly arranged against the side of the house. There was nothing to distinguish it from any other family home on the street, nothing to suggest it housed a teenager suspected of triple homicide. Detective Martin rang the doorbell at precisely 7:15 a.m., timing the visit when he knew the household would be awake, but before the children would have left for school, positioning the other officers strategically around the property in case intervention became necessary. Raymond Powell answered the door still holding a coffee mug, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern, as Martin identified himself and requested to speak with the Powells about one of their foster children. Inside the home, the atmosphere of normalcy was jarring given the circumstances. The smell of breakfast lingering in the air, the sound of a television cartoon coming from another room, a backpack resting on a chair by the door, ready for school. Anita Powell emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her welcoming smile fading as she registered the serious expressions of the officers now standing in her living room. When Detective Martin explained that they needed to speak with Theo regarding a serious criminal investigation, the Powells' initial reaction was disbelief bordering on indignation. "There must be some mistake," Raymond insisted, his voice low to avoid being overheard by the children. "Theo is a quiet kid, keeps to himself mostly, but he's not in any kind of trouble." Anita nodded in agreement, adding, "He's been with us for almost 7 months now, and while he struggles to connect sometimes, he's always been respectful and follows our house rules." The genuine confusion and concern on their faces suggested they had no knowledge of or involvement in Theo's actions the previous night, a fact that would later be confirmed when their own Halloween night alibi was verified. They had taken their 3 other foster children trick-or-treating in a different neighborhood, while Theo had claimed to be feeling unwell and stayed home. Detective Martin requested to speak with Theo immediately, and Raymond led him to a bedroom at the back of the house, where Theo shared space with another foster child, a 12-year-old boy who had already left the room to eat breakfast. They found Theo sitting on his bed, fully dressed for school in jeans and a plain blue t-shirt, reading a comic book with an expression of complete absorption. The teenager looked up as the door opened, his face showing mild annoyance at the interruption rather than the fear or guilt one might expect from someone who had committed a brutal triple homicide less than 12 hours earlier. This lack of emotional response, which would become a defining characteristic of Theo's demeanor throughout the legal proceedings to follow, struck Martin immediately as profoundly unsettling. "Theo Robertson," the detective began formally, "I need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts last night, Halloween night." The teenager's face remained impassive as he set the comic book aside, his blue eyes meeting Martin's with an unnerving steadiness. "I was here," he replied simply, his voice breaking slightly in the way typical of adolescent boys. "I didn't feel good, so I stayed home while the Powells took everyone else trick-or-treating." When Martin asked if anyone could verify his presence at home, Theo shrugged, a gesture that seemed simultaneously childlike and calculating. "No one was here. I watched TV for a while and then went to bed." The moment of arrest came when Martin directly confronted Theo with the fingerprint evidence, explaining that his prints had been found on a weapon used to kill 3 people the previous night. For a brief moment, something flickered across the teenager's face, not guilt or remorse, but something closer to recognition, as if acknowledging that a game had concluded. "The metal pipe had your fingerprints on it, Theo," Martin stated, watching the boy's reaction carefully. The same fingerprints that were taken when you were arrested for vandalism in February. A perfect match with no room for error. Theo's response was to look down at his hands, turning them palms up as if seeing them for the first time, before meeting the detective's gaze again and saying nothing at all. As Martin read Theo his Miranda rights, modified for a juvenile suspect, the other officers entered the room, and one placed handcuffs on the teenager's wrists. The handcuffs, adult-sized, slipped slightly on Theo's slender wrists, a stark visual reminder that the suspect was indeed still physically a child despite the adult nature of his alleged crimes. Raymond Powell watched from the doorway, his expression having transformed from confusion to horror as the reality of the situation became clear. Behind him, Anita could be heard gathering the other children in the kitchen, her voice artificially bright as she instructed them to finish breakfast quickly because they would be leaving for school early today. The arrest of a juvenile suspect required additional protocols beyond those for adult offenders, with parental notification being a primary concern. As Theo had no legal parents or guardians beyond the state itself, his caseworker was contacted immediately while he was transported to a special juvenile holding facility rather than the main Miami-Dade detention center. Throughout the process, being led from the Powell home, placed in the back of an unmarked police car, and processed at the juvenile facility, Theo maintained an eerie calm that unsettled even experienced officers. One would later describe him as completely flat, like he was waiting for a bus, not being arrested for murder. News of the arrest spread quickly through official channels, though in accordance with Florida law regarding juvenile offenders, Theo's name and image were initially withheld from public reports. Local Miami media outlets reported only that a juvenile suspect had been taken into custody in connection with the Harris family murders, though the suspect's age, 14, was released, generating immediate public speculation and debate about how such a young person could commit such a violent crime. Within hours of the arrest, media vans had gathered outside both the juvenile detention center and the courthouse, their satellite dishes raised toward the clear Miami sky like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. The Powell foster home became an unexpected secondary crime scene, as investigators sought to understand Theo's movements on Halloween night and to search for any additional evidence. With the Powell's permission, officers conducted a thorough search of Theo's living space, finding little of note beyond what one would expect in a teenage boy's room. The clothing Theo had allegedly worn during the murders was not found, nor was the Halloween mask described by witnesses, suggesting he had disposed of these items somewhere between the crime scene and the foster home. The search did, however, yield one significant item: a notebook hidden beneath Theo's mattress, containing drawings of families being attacked by a shadowy figure, images that were disturbing both in their content and in the meticulous detail with which they had been rendered. By midday, as Miami's temperature climbed into the high 80s and tourists on South Beach remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding across the city, Detective Martin was preparing for his initial interview with Theo at the juvenile facility. Florida law required that a juvenile suspect be represented by counsel during questioning, and a public defender had been assigned to Theo's case with remarkable speed given the high-profile nature of the crimes. Martin reviewed the evidence once more before the interview: the fingerprints on the murder weapon, the security camera footage showing someone of Theo's size and build in the vicinity of the crime, the notebook with its violent drawings, and the lack of a verified alibi for the time of the murders. The case against Theo was already strong, but what the detective still lacked was any understanding of why this particular teenager had targeted this particular family on Halloween night. The investigation into Theo Robertson's movements on Halloween night yielded a disturbing timeline that pointed toward premeditation rather than an impulsive act of violence. Security cameras from businesses along the bus route between Little Haiti and Coconut Grove captured Theo boarding a city bus at 5:42 p.m., approximately 90 minutes before the estimated time of the murders. The teenager had been wearing ordinary clothes, jeans, a dark hoodie, and a backpack, with nothing to suggest his deadly intentions blending in with the other Halloween evening commuters. Subsequent camera footage showed him exiting the bus 10 blocks from the Harris home at 6:17 p.m., his backpack still in place, his movement purposeful as he walked toward the affluent neighborhood where the family lived. Detective Martin secured a warrant to access Theo's school-issued laptop, which had been found in his room at the Powell foster home. The device's search history revealed multiple visits to the Harris family's social media accounts in the weeks leading up to Halloween, suggesting that Theo had been monitoring their activities and perhaps planning his attack for some time. Of particular interest to investigators was his repeated viewing of family vacation photos, Halloween celebration pictures from previous years, and a recent post by Jessica Harris about the family's plans to set up decorations on Halloween evening. Digital forensic specialist Maya Ortiz also discovered that Theo had searched for information about metal pipes, blunt force trauma, and methods for cleaning fingerprints from weapons, searches that aligned perfectly with the physical evidence found at the crime scene. As the digital investigation proceeded, detectives also focused on establishing the connection between Theo and the Harris family, initially puzzled by why he would target this specific household. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Theo's school records indicated that he had briefly attended Coconut Grove Elementary 3 years earlier, during his second foster placement, where Jessica Harris had been teaching 3rd grade. Although Theo had not been in her class, he would have seen her daily in the hallways and school events during his 4 months at the school. This connection, while seemingly tenuous, provided the first link between the perpetrator and his victims, though it still failed to explain the extreme violence of the attack. Further insight came from Theo's current social worker, Denise Calloway, who had been managing his case for the past 18 months. In interviews with Detective Martin, Calloway appeared visibly distressed, struggling to reconcile the cooperative if withdrawn child she knew with the monster described in the arrest report. Theo has always had difficulty processing his feelings about his mother's abandonment, she explained, her hands restlessly rearranging the papers in his thick case file. He exhibited particular distress when exposed to what he perceived as perfect families, often becoming withdrawn or irritable after school events where parents were present or after seeing classmates being picked up by their parents. This pattern of emotional triggering aligned with what investigators were beginning to suspect, that the Harris family, with their visible happiness and stability, represented everything Theo had been denied in his own life. The metal pipe used in the attack became the centerpiece of the prosecution's physical evidence, with forensic analysis confirming that blood from all 3 victims was present on the weapon. The fingerprints remained the most damning evidence, with 13 distinct points of comparison matching Theo's prints taken after his previous arrest. Forensic analyst Sophia Chen prepared detailed visualizations showing the fingerprint matches, creating exhibits that would later prove devastating in court. Additional evidence came from microscopic fabric transfers found on the pipe that matched fibers from the clothing the Harris family had been wearing, as well as a partial palm print on the curved end of the pipe that also matched Theo's hand geometry. Security camera footage from the neighborhood provided crucial evidence of Theo's state of mind before the attack. One particularly revealing clip, obtained from a home 3 blocks from the Harris residence, showed the teenager watching a father and son in Halloween costumes from behind a parked car, his body language tense and his attention unwavering for nearly 5 minutes. Another camera captured him following a group of trick-or-treaters from house to house without ever approaching the doors himself, always maintaining a distance, observing rather than participating. The most damning footage came from a camera mounted on a property adjacent to the Harris home, which showed a figure matching Theo's description watching the family's driveway for 43 minutes before approaching as they unloaded decorations from their vehicle. The prosecutors assigned to the case, led by Victoria Campbell, a veteran of Miami's most high-profile violent crime prosecutions, moved quickly to have Theo charged as an adult despite his age, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and its extreme brutality. Florida law allowed for such transfers from juvenile to adult court in cases of violent felonies, particularly those involving multiple victims. The decision sparked immediate controversy in Miami's legal community, with children's rights advocates arguing that a 14-year-old lacked the brain development necessary for true adult culpability, while victims' rights groups countered that the heinous nature of the crime demanded the most severe possible consequences regardless of the perpetrator's age. As the legal battles over jurisdiction began, Detective Martin focused on understanding the psychological aspects of the case, particularly interested in exploring Theo's motive more deeply. He arranged for Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic psychologist specializing in juvenile offenders, to review Theo's case file and interview materials. After 3 days of analysis, Dr. Vasquez provided a preliminary assessment that would prove crucial to the prosecution's theory. The subject appears to exhibit a profound sense of abandonment and rejection stemming from his mother's actions when he was 9. Rather than directing his rage at his mother, however, he seems to have transferred it to families that represent what he has been denied: stability, connection, and belonging. This psychological framework helped explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the case: why Theo had targeted a family with whom he had no significant personal history or conflict. Dr. Vasquez suggested that the Harris family likely served as symbolic representatives of the family unit that had failed Theo so profoundly, with his rage intensified by the Halloween setting that highlighted family bonding and community connection. Halloween is a holiday that emphasizes family participation and neighborhood belonging, the psychologist noted in her report. For a child who has never experienced stability in either family or community, watching these celebrations from the outside could trigger an acute psychological crisis, particularly in an adolescent already struggling with identity formation and emotional regulation. The investigation also uncovered troubling patterns in Theo's behavior in the weeks leading up to Halloween. His teachers at Miami Edison High School reported that he had become increasingly withdrawn since mid-October, skipping classes and responding with unusual hostility when questioned about his absences. His English teacher, noting a sharp decline in his academic performance, had attempted to schedule a conference with his foster parents but had received no response to her emails. A school counselor who had met with Theo briefly in late October described him as unusually flat in affect and had made a note to follow up, but the meeting had never occurred due to scheduling conflicts. The Powells, still reeling from the revelation about their foster child, provided additional insights during follow-up interviews. Anita Powell recalled that Theo had shown particular interest in a Halloween special on television featuring families decorating their homes together, watching it with unusual intensity while the other children in the home played nearby. Raymond Powell mentioned that Theo had asked to go trick-or-treating with the family on Halloween night, but then abruptly changed his mind that morning, claiming he felt ill. The couple had accepted his excuse without question, accustomed to his frequent mood shifts and occasional need for solitude, never imagining that their trust would enable him to commit such a horrific crime. Perhaps the most chilling evidence came from Theo's notebook, discovered during the search of his room at the Powell home. The drawings inside depicted not random violence, but specifically showed families being attacked while engaged in everyday activities, eating dinner, watching television, playing in a yard. Forensic document analysis revealed that these drawings had been created over several months, suggesting a long-brewing fantasy of violence rather than a sudden impulse. Particularly disturbing was a drawing dated October 27th, just 4 days before the murders, that showed a figure with a pipe standing over 3 bodies in what appeared to be a driveway, with Halloween decorations visible in the background. As the case against Theo solidified, Miami struggled to process the revelation that such extreme violence had been perpetrated by a child. The city, accustomed to crime headlines featuring adult offenders, drug cartels, and organized crime, seemed collectively unable to comprehend how someone so young could commit an act so brutal. Local talk radio shows were flooded with callers offering theories ranging from mental illness to demonic possession, while psychologists interviewed on television news attempted to provide context about childhood trauma and its potential consequences. Parents across Miami reported their children asking difficult questions about whether kids could be bad people, questions for which they had no adequate answers. By the end of the first week following the murders, the prosecution had assembled a case against Theo that included the fingerprint evidence, security camera footage, digital forensics from his laptop, the drawings from his notebook, and expert psychological analysis of his motive. What they still lacked was any statement from Theo himself, as he had remained almost entirely silent since his arrest, speaking only briefly to his appointed attorney. This silence, combined with his unsettling lack of visible emotion, contributed to a growing public perception of Theo as something other than a typical troubled teenager, something closer to the juvenile predator label that sensationalist media outlets had begun to apply to him. The Miami courtroom where Theo's hearing to determine adult or juvenile status would be held was prepared for the media circus that would inevitably surround the case. Additional security measures were implemented, media seating arranged, and special accommodations made for the families of the victims who would be in attendance. As the tropical November heat continued unabated outside, the air-conditioned courthouse became the focal point for a city's collective grief, rage, and confusion, all centered on the slight figure of a 14-year-old boy who had, in 4 minutes of extreme violence on Halloween night, destroyed 3 lives and irreparably damaged countless others. The juvenile detention facility where Theo Robertson awaited his initial court appearance was a stark concrete building in northern Miami. Its institutional facade softened only slightly by half-hearted attempts at murals and landscaping. Inside, the reality was equally bleak. Fluorescent lighting, monitored common areas, and small individual rooms designed to house troubled youth while their cases moved through the juvenile justice system. Theo had been placed in a high-security section typically reserved for violent offenders, isolated from the general population, both for his own protection and due to the severity of his alleged crimes. The facility staff, accustomed to dealing with teenage drug offenders and gang members, appeared visibly uncomfortable with the quiet, polite 14-year-old now in their charge, a boy whose demeanor gave no hint of the brutality he was accused of inflicting on the Harris family. Detective Gabriel Martin arrived at the detention facility 48 hours after Theo's arrest, having allowed time for the teenager to meet with his court-appointed attorney and for the initial shock of incarceration to subside. The detective had spent those intervening hours immersing himself in Theo's background, reviewing every available document from his school records, foster care history, and previous juvenile case. Martin had been particularly interested in reports from Theo's various foster placements, noting a recurring theme of the boy seeming unreachable emotionally, maintaining a polite but distant facade that prevented genuine connections with his temporary families. This pattern of emotional detachment aligned with what Martin had observed during the arrest, a disturbing absence of the fear, remorse, or even defiance typically seen in juvenile offenders. The interrogation room at the juvenile facility was designed to be less intimidating than its adult counterpart, with comfortable chairs, neutral-colored walls, and large windows that admitted Miami's bright natural light. These attempts at creating a more humane environment seemed lost on Theo as he was led into the room by a facility guard, his thin wrists and ankles connected by restraints that jingled softly with each step. He moved with the awkward gait of early adolescence, his body still caught in that uncertain territory between childhood and adulthood, a physical manifestation of the legal limbo he now occupied. His court-appointed attorney, Monica Rivera, a public defender with a reputation for fierce advocacy for juvenile clients, was already seated at the table, her expression guarded as Martin and his colleague, Detective Patel, entered the room. "Good morning, Theo," Martin began, his tone deliberately conversational as he set a folder on the table and took a seat across from the teenager. "I'm Detective Martin, and this is Detective Patel. We'd like to ask you some questions about Halloween night." Theo's eyes, a pale blue that appeared almost colorless under the fluorescent lights, flicked briefly to the detective's face before returning to a middle-distance stare, his expression revealing nothing. Attorney Rivera interjected immediately, establishing the ground rules for the interview and reminding Theo of his right to end the conversation at any time. Throughout this preliminary exchange, the teenager remained silent, his hands resting limply on the table, the restraints appearing unnecessarily large against his slender wrists. Martin began with simple, non-threatening questions, asking about Theo's daily routine at the Powell foster home, his school experience, his interests and activities. The detective's approach was deliberate, building rapport while observing Theo's responses for behavioral baselines before transitioning to more sensitive topics. To these innocuous inquiries, Theo provided minimal but cooperative answers, his voice soft and occasionally breaking with adolescent pitch changes. "School's okay," he offered, in response to a question about Miami Edison High. "I like science class sometimes, and lunch break." The normalcy of these responses created a jarring contrast with the circumstances of the interview, a reminder that the suspect was, in many ways, still very much a child. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly when Martin transitioned to questions about Halloween night, placing a photograph of the Harris family on the table between them. The image showed Kevin, Jessica, and Mason at a school function several months earlier, their smiles bright, their postures relaxed and happy as they stood together against a backdrop of student artwork. "Theo, do you recognize this family?" Martin asked, his voice remaining steady, even as he watched carefully for any change in the teenager's demeanor. For the first time since entering the room, Theo's expression altered slightly, a subtle tightening around his eyes, a momentary focus that replaced his previous dissociation. He did not answer verbally, but gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Martin then placed a second photograph on the table, this one showing the metal pipe that had been recovered from the bushes near the crime scene. "We found your fingerprints on this weapon, Theo," the detective stated matter-of-factly, not as an accusation, but as a simple presentation of evidence. "The same fingerprints that were taken when you were arrested in February, a perfect match with 13 distinct points of comparison." At this, Attorney Rivera leaned forward slightly, her body language protective, even as she remained silent, allowing her client the opportunity to respond if he chose to. Theo stared at the photograph of the pipe for several long moments, then raised his eyes to meet Martin's directly for the first time. "I was there," he said finally, his voice so quiet that the detective had to lean forward to hear him. "I was there on Halloween." This admission, while far from a full confession, represented the first crack in Theo's silence, the first acknowledgement of his presence at the scene of the murders. Martin maintained a neutral expression, careful not to respond in a way that might cause the teenager to retreat back into silence. "Can you tell me why you were there, Theo?" he asked, keeping his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "What brought you to the Harris family's home that night?" What followed was not the detailed confession the detective had hoped for, but rather a series of fragmented statements that provided glimpses into Theo's thinking. "I was watching the trick-or-treaters," he said, his gaze drifting to the window where Miami's relentless sunshine created patterns on the institutional floor. All these families together, the kids with their parents, everyone happy and safe. A lengthy silence followed this observation, during which Theo seemed to retreat into his own thoughts, his face once again becoming unreadable. When he spoke again, his voice had a detached quality that sent a chill through the room despite the tropical heat outside. "They looked so happy. They had everything I never got to have." This statement, which would later become central to the prosecution's theory of motive, hung in the air as Martin carefully steered the conversation toward the specific events of the night. "What happened after you watched the trick-or-treaters, Theo?" he asked, deliberately avoiding direct questions about the attack itself at this stage. Theo's response was to look down at his hands, turning them palms up as he had done during his arrest, a gesture that seemed to hold some private significance for him. "I found the pipe at a construction site," he said, after another long pause. "I took it with me when I got on the bus." Attorney Rivera intervened at this point, requesting a brief pause to confer with her client, concerned about the increasingly self-incriminating nature of his statements. During this consultation, conducted in whispers at the far end of the room, Martin observed the strange dynamic between the experienced defender and her young client, Rivera speaking intently, Theo nodding occasionally but appearing detached from the legal consequences she was undoubtedly explaining to him. When they returned to the table, Rivera announced that while Theo would continue answering questions about his movements and observations on Halloween night, he would not discuss the specific moments of the attack without further legal consultation. The interrogation continued for nearly 3 hours, with Theo providing disjointed but revelatory information about his activities before and after the time of the murders. He described riding the bus to Coconut Grove, walking through the neighborhood watching families trick-or-treating, and specifically following the Harris family as they returned to their home. What emerged most clearly was not a story of random violence, but of targeted obsession. Theo had apparently been aware of the Harris family for some time, had possibly selected them specifically because of their visible happiness as a family unit, and had watched them from afar before approaching their driveway on Halloween night. The most chilling moment of the interrogation came near its conclusion, when Martin showed Theo a school photograph of Mason Harris, the 8-year-old victim. "Did you know he was just a child?" the detective asked, momentarily allowing his professional detachment to slip as he thought of his own children at home. Theo looked at the smiling face of the boy he had killed, his expression unchanging as he delivered a response that would later be quoted in every news report about the case. "He got to be someone's real son. He got what I never had, and he didn't even know how lucky he was." The simplicity of this statement, delivered without apparent emotion, revealed more about Theo's motive than any psychological evaluation could have. As the interrogation concluded and Theo was led back to his cell, Martin and Patel remained in the room, both experienced detectives visibly shaken by the interaction. "In 20 years on the force, I've never interviewed a suspect like that," Martin admitted, gathering his notes with hands that were not quite steady. "Not the violence, we've seen worse, but the emptiness behind it." Patel nodded in agreement, adding, "He talked about killing that family like he was describing a movie he watched, like it happened to someone else." This emotional disconnect, this fundamental absence of human empathy, would become the aspect of the case that troubled even the most hardened members of Miami's law enforcement community. The information obtained during the interrogation was immediately shared with Prosecutor Victoria Campbell, who recognized both its value and its limitations for the upcoming legal proceedings. While Theo had admitted to being at the scene and had made statements strongly suggesting his role in the murders, he had not provided an explicit confession to the physical acts themselves. Campbell began preparing motions to have Theo evaluated by a team of forensic psychologists, anticipating that the defense would likely pursue a strategy based on diminished capacity or mental illness, given the extreme nature of the crimes and the defendant's young age. News of Theo's statements during the interrogation, particularly his comment about Mason Harris getting to be someone's real son, leaked to the Miami press within hours, despite the confidentiality protections normally accorded to juvenile cases. The public reaction was immediate and visceral, with local talk radio hosts demanding that Theo be tried as an adult and subjected to the harshest possible penalties under Florida law. The Harris family's relatives, who had maintained a dignified silence in the immediate aftermath of the murders, issued a statement through their attorney expressing their belief that justice requires treating this crime according to its severity, not according to the age of the person who committed it. In the Powell foster home, now under constant media surveillance despite police efforts to protect the family's privacy, Raymond and Anita struggled to support their 3 remaining foster children while processing their own feelings of shock, guilt, and betrayal. We keep asking ourselves what we missed, what signs we should have seen, Raymond told Detective Patel during a follow-up interview. He was in our home, at our dinner table every night, and we never imagined he was capable of this. Their distress was compounded by threatening phone calls and social media messages from members of the public who held them partially responsible for failing to recognize the danger Theo posed, forcing the police to establish a protective detail around their home. The interrogation had provided crucial insights into Theo's motive, but had raised as many questions as it answered about how a 14-year-old foster child had developed the capacity for such extreme violence. Forensic psychologist Dr. Elena Vasquez, after reviewing the transcript, noted the pronounced disconnect between Theo's emotional presentation and the content of his statements. What we're seeing is consistent with severe attachment disorder complicated by complex trauma, she explained to the prosecution team. His experiences of abandonment and instability appear to have created a profound sense of injustice and rage specifically directed at the concept of family itself. Within the Juvenile Detention Center, staff reported that Theo had adapted to the structured environment with unusual ease, following rules meticulously and interacting politely but minimally with both staff and other residents during his limited supervised contact periods. One staff member described him as the least troublesome resident we have, which is the most troubling thing about him. Unlike many juvenile offenders who acted out, demanded attention, or struggled with the restrictions of detention, Theo seemed almost comfortable with the institutional setting, as if the clear boundaries and absence of emotional expectations provided a relief that his various foster homes had not. As Miami's legal system prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most high-profile juvenile cases in the city's history, the interrogation had established the foundation for the prosecution's narrative. A deeply damaged child, repeatedly failed by both his biological family and the system designed to protect him, who had transformed his personal pain into an act of extreme violence against a family that represented everything he had been denied. This narrative would be tested in the courtroom, where the legal questions of competency, culpability, and appropriate consequences for a 14-year-old who had committed adult crimes would be debated under the intense scrutiny of a city still reeling from the Halloween night horror that had left 3 beloved community members dead and exposed the dangerous depths of a child's unhealed wounds. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse stood as an imposing neoclassical structure in downtown Miami, its limestone facade gleaming in the tropical morning sun as camera crews assembled on its broad steps. 6 weeks had passed since the Halloween night murders, and the legal machinery had moved with unusual speed, propelled by public interest and the straightforward nature of the evidence against Theo Robertson. After 3 contentious hearings, Judge Eleanor Ramirez had ruled that Theo would be tried as an adult despite his age, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and the exceptional violence with which it had been executed. This decision had been met with both praise from victims' advocates and condemnation from juvenile justice reformers, setting the stage for a trial that would divide public opinion in Miami and across Florida. Inside Courtroom 3B, with its polished wood paneling and state seal mounted prominently behind the judge's bench, final preparations were underway for the opening day of proceedings. The gallery had been divided, with the front rows on the right reserved for the Harris family's relatives and friends, and those on the left allocated to court officials, selected media representatives, and a rotating group of public observers chosen by lottery due to the extraordinary interest in the case. Special accommodations had been made for juvenile justice advocates who had argued that Theo's trial should remain in the juvenile system, with a small section of seating designated for their representatives to monitor the proceedings and document what they considered the systemic failings of trying a 14-year-old in adult court. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Judge Ramirez entered the courtroom, her black robe swirling around her as she moved with brisk efficiency to the bench. A 30-year veteran of Florida's judicial system, with a reputation for strict courtroom management and little tolerance for media theatrics, Ramirez had been specifically assigned to the case based on her extensive experience with high-profile proceedings. After calling the court to order, she addressed the packed gallery with a stern warning about decorum and her zero-tolerance policy for emotional outbursts or attempts to influence the jury through visible reactions. The judge's gaze lingered particularly on the row of reporters, frantically taking notes, her message clear that she would not allow her courtroom to become a stage for the media spectacle that had surrounded the case since its inception. The juror selection process had been grueling, requiring an unusually large jury pool due to the extensive media coverage and the emotional nature of the crimes. After 5 days of questioning, 12 jurors and 4 alternates had been seated, a diverse group that reflected Miami's multicultural population, ranging in age from a 23-year-old university student to a 71-year-old retired school principal. The jury entered the courtroom solemnly, many appearing visibly uncomfortable with the responsibility before them, their eyes darting nervously toward the defense table where they expected to see the teenage defendant whose fate they would determine. When Theo Robertson was finally led into the courtroom by 2 sheriff's deputies, an audible ripple of reaction passed through the gallery despite Judge Ramirez's warnings. The contrast between the heinous nature of the crimes and the small, almost fragile-looking defendant was stark and unsettling. Theo entered without looking at the spectators, his eyes fixed on the floor, wearing a navy blue suit that had been purchased by the public defender's office to replace his detention center uniform. The suit hung loosely on his thin frame, the shoulders too wide and the pants cuffed several times at the ankles, creating the impression of a child playing dress-up in adult clothing, an unintentionally powerful visual metaphor for the central question of the trial itself. Prosecutor Victoria Campbell rose for the state's opening statement, her tailored crimson suit a bold splash of color in the otherwise somber courtroom. At 45, Campbell had built her career prosecuting Miami's most violent offenders, but even she seemed affected by the unusual nature of this case, her typically forceful presence tempered by the gravity of prosecuting a defendant so young. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the hushed courtroom, "this case will ask you to confront a disturbing reality. that acts of extreme violence can be committed by individuals we might not immediately recognize as dangerous, including, tragically, children who have experienced profound trauma and developed the capacity for terrible harm. Campbell proceeded to lay out the state's case methodically, describing the events of Halloween night 2024 in chronological detail, while large screens displayed a timeline alongside photographs of the crime scene, carefully edited to exclude the most graphic images out of respect for both the Harris family and the jury. "The evidence will show," she continued, holding up an evidence bag containing the metal pipe, now cleaned of blood, but still bearing the distinctive bend from the force of the blows, "that this weapon bears the fingerprints of the defendant in 13 distinct locations, prints that match those on file from a previous juvenile offense with a statistical certainty that leaves no room for reasonable doubt." As Campbell described the forensic evidence linking Theo to the murders, she walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror in turn, her expression somber but determined. "You will hear expert testimony confirming that blood from all three victims, Kevin Harris, Jessica Harris, and their 8-year-old son Mason, was found on this pipe, and that the force required to inflict their fatal injuries required deliberate, repeated strikes delivered with extreme violence." At the mention of Mason's name, a muffled sob could be heard from the Harris family section, quickly stifled as Judge Ramirez cast a sympathetic but warning glance in that direction. The heart of the prosecution's opening focused on establishing Theo's motive, with Campbell introducing the theory that would form the backbone of their case against the teenager. The evidence will demonstrate that the defendant, who had spent years in foster care after being abandoned by his biological mother, harbored a deep resentment toward families he perceived as happy and stable. She displayed a photograph of the Harris family at a school event, their smiles bright and natural as they stood with arms around each other. This family, loving, connected, and enjoying the simple pleasure of celebrating Halloween together, represented everything the defendant had been denied in his own life, and that perceived injustice fostered a rage that ultimately exploded in violence. Campbell concluded her opening statement by addressing head-on the difficult question of Theo's age and its relevance to the proceedings. "The state recognizes that the defendant is chronologically a child," she acknowledged, her voice softening slightly, "and the tragedy of this case extends to the circumstances that may have shaped his capacity for violence. However, the evidence will show that his actions on Halloween night were not impulsive or unconsidered, but rather reflected planning, intention, and a clear understanding of both the nature and consequences of his actions." As she returned to her seat, Campbell paused briefly beside the table where Theo sat, the teenager's gaze still fixed downward, apparently unmoved by the prosecutor's description of the crimes he was accused of committing. Defense attorney Monica Rivera approached her opening statement with a markedly different energy, her movements deliberate and her voice quiet, forcing the courtroom to lean forward to hear her. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, standing directly in front of her young client with a protective posture, "before you sits a 14-year-old child who has never known the stability, security, or unconditional love that most of us take for granted. The prosecution has presented you with evidence of fingerprints and blood, with timelines and security footage. But what they cannot show you, what no physical evidence can reveal, is the profound psychological damage inflicted on Theo Robertson long before the events of Halloween night." Rivera, a veteran public defender who had specifically requested Theo's case, despite its challenges and the public antipathy toward her client, outlined a defense strategy centered not on denying Theo's actions, but on contextualizing them within his history of trauma and abandonment. The evidence will show that by age 14, Theo had been placed in 7 different foster homes after being found alone in an apartment at age 9, abandoned by his mother, who chose drugs over her child. She detailed the repeated disruptions of his placements, each failed connection reinforcing his sense of unworthiness and deepening his inability to form healthy attachments or regulate his emotions. Medical experts will testify, Rivera continued, now standing beside Theo with a gentle hand on the back of his chair, that the developing brain is particularly vulnerable to the effects of early trauma and that children who experience severe attachment disruption may develop profoundly altered perceptions of themselves and others. She introduced the concept that would form the foundation of Theo's defense, that his capacity to understand the wrongfulness of his actions or to control his behavior had been compromised by years of systematic trauma that the state had failed to adequately address through appropriate interventions. Unlike Campbell, who had engaged directly with the jury throughout her presentation, Rivera directed significant portions of her opening statement to the gallery and media representatives, clearly aware that this case was being tried both in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. This trial is not only about determining what happened on Halloween night, she argued passionately, but about examining our collective responsibility for a child who fell through every crack in a system designed to protect him. This framing of the case as a societal failure, rather than simply an individual crime, clearly resonated with the juvenile justice advocates in the gallery, several of whom nodded in visible agreement. The defense attorney concluded with a direct appeal to the jury's capacity for nuanced understanding rather than reflexive judgment. I ask you not to view Theo Robertson as a monster, as the prosecution suggests, but as a deeply wounded child whose actions, however terrible, emerged from circumstances beyond his control or understanding. As Rivera returned to her seat, she squeezed Theo's shoulder gently, a gesture the teenager neither acknowledged nor rejected, his expression remaining as impassive as it had been throughout both opening statements. Judge Ramirez called a brief recess before the prosecution's first witness, during which the courtroom hummed with subdued conversation, the assembled spectators processing the starkly different narratives presented by the two. Legal teams. In the hallway outside, media commentators were already dissecting the opening statements, with legal analysts noting that the case would likely hinge not on whether Theo had committed the acts, the evidence of which appeared overwhelming, but on the jury's willingness to accept diminished capacity as a mitigating factor for such extreme violence, particularly when the defendant was so young. When court resumed, the prosecution called its first witness, Eleanor Winters, the 78-year-old neighbor who had placed the 911 call on Halloween night. Mrs. Winters entered the courtroom slowly, assisted by her adult daughter, her white hair perfectly styled and her posture dignified despite her evident frailty. As she took the stand and was sworn in, her eyes briefly met Theo's for the first time since she had witnessed him fleeing the scene of the murders, and the elderly woman visibly flinched, a reaction that Campbell allowed to register with the jury before beginning her questioning. Mrs. Winters recounted in a clear but trembling voice what she had seen from her porch across the street, the Harris family unloading decorations from their SUV, the figure in the skeleton mask approaching from between parked cars, the horrifying sequence of violence that had unfolded with shocking speed. "I thought it was a Halloween prank at first," she testified, her hands twisted together in her lap. "When Kevin fell, I actually thought he was pretending until I saw the blood and heard Jessica screaming." Her testimony, delivered with the clarity of someone who had replayed the events countless times in her mind, provided the jury with their first eyewitness account of the murders, making real what had previously been described only in legal and forensic terms. Under cross-examination, Rivera approached the elderly witness with gentle respect, focusing not on challenging her account of what had happened, but on what she could not have known from her vantage point. "Mrs. Winters, from your porch, you could see the physical actions that occurred. Is that correct?" The witness agreed, and Rivera continued, "But you could not see the attacker's face behind the mask, nor could you hear any words that might have been exchanged." Mrs. Winters acknowledged these limitations, and Rivera thanked her for her testimony before returning to her seat, having established the first small element of her defense strategy, that external observations, however accurate, could not reveal the internal state of her young client. As the first day of trial concluded, the Miami sunset cast long shadows across the courthouse steps where reporters delivered their evening broadcasts against the backdrop of palm trees and government architecture. Inside courtroom 3B, now empty except for cleaning staff preparing for the next day's proceedings, the weight of what had begun hung in the air, a trial that would not only determine the fate of a 14-year-old defendant, but would force a community to confront uncomfortable questions about childhood trauma, systemic failures, and the capacity of the justice system to address both punishment and rehabilitation when the perpetrator of horrific violence is, legally and developmentally, still a child. Judge Ramirez, reviewing her notes in chambers after the courtroom had cleared, paused to look at a photograph of Theo Robertson taken on the day of his arrest. A school portrait showing a solemn-faced boy with eyes that seemed much older than their years. The judge, known for her tough sentencing and no-nonsense approach to violent crime, found herself uncharacteristically troubled by the case before her. In her 3 decades on the bench, she had presided over hundreds of murder trials, but none that had forced her to wrestle so directly with the collision between childhood vulnerability and adult accountability, between trauma as explanation and trauma as excuse, between a society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members and its equal obligation to deliver justice for victims of terrible violence. On the 5th day of trial, the courtroom fell silent as Sophia Chen, the Miami-Dade Crime Lab's senior fingerprint analyst, took the stand. Chen, with her crisp white lab coat and methodical demeanor, represented the scientific heart of the prosecution's case against Theo Robertson. After establishing her credentials, 15 years of experience, over 2,000 cases analyzed, and numerous expert testimonies in state and federal courts, Prosecutor Victoria Campbell moved directly to the central physical evidence linking the defendant to the crime scene. "Ms. Chen, I'd like to direct your attention to People's Exhibit 17, Campbell said, as a court officer handed the witness a sealed evidence bag containing the metal pipe. "Can you identify this item for the court?" Chen confirmed that this was the weapon recovered near the Harris family's home, which she had personally analyzed in the days following the murders. Using a laser pointer, she directed the jury's attention to high-resolution photographs displayed on the courtroom screens, showing the pipe from multiple angles with specific areas highlighted. "My analysis identified 13 distinct fingerprint impressions on this weapon that were suitable for comparison purposes," she explained, her voice clear and confident. These impressions were primarily concentrated on the handle portion of the pipe, consistent with how someone would grip it to use as a striking implement. The jury leaned forward collectively, their attention captured by the meticulous presentation of science that seemed to leave little room for doubt. The most damning portion of Chen's testimony came when Campbell asked her to explain the comparison process and results. "I compared the fingerprints found on the murder weapon with the known fingerprints of Theo Robertson, which were on file from a previous juvenile arrest in February 2024. Chen testified, gesturing to side-by-side images showing ridge patterns with connecting lines between matching points. Using standard methodology accepted throughout the forensic community, I identified 13 points of comparison between the prints on the weapon and the defendant's known prints, far exceeding the 8 points typically required for a positive identification in court. She then provided a statistical analysis suggesting the likelihood of these prints belonging to anyone other than Theo was less than 1 in several billion, effectively eliminating any reasonable doubt about who had handled the murder weapon. During cross-examination, defense attorney Monica Rivera took a surprising approach, choosing not to challenge the fingerprint evidence itself, but rather to establish its limitations within the broader narrative. "Ms. Chen," she began, her tone respectful of the analyst's expertise, "your analysis can definitively establish that my client touched this pipe. Is that correct?" When Chen agreed, Rivera continued, "But your analysis cannot tell us when he touched it, under what circumstances he touched it, or what his mental state was at the time he touched it. Can it?" The analyst conceded these points, acknowledging that fingerprint analysis, while scientifically sound for identification purposes, could not speak to context or intent, a small but important qualification that Rivera would build upon throughout the defense case. The forensic presentation continued with Dr. James Keller, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsies on all three Harris family members. A veteran pathologist with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Dr. Keller projected an air of somber authority as he detailed the cause of death for each victim. Kevin Harris died from a single, catastrophic blow to the occipital region, the back of the head, which caused immediate brain hemorrhaging, and would have resulted in instantaneous unconsciousness followed quickly by death, he testified, using anatomical models to demonstrate the location and angle of impact. His clinical description provided a stark contrast to the emotional reality of what had occurred, a dissonance that seemed to affect several jurors who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The medical examiner's testimony became visibly more difficult for everyone in the courtroom when he discussed the autopsies of Jessica and Mason Harris, both of whom had suffered multiple blows, indicating they had been alive and possibly conscious for the initial attacks. "The pattern of injuries suggests defensive wounds," Dr. Keller explained, his professional demeanor briefly cracking when describing the child victim's injuries. Mason Harris had fractures to both forearms consistent with attempts to shield himself from the blows. At this point, several of the Harris family members left the courtroom, unable to bear the detailed description of their loved one's final moments, while Theo remained motionless at the defense table, his expression unchanged as the horrific consequences of his actions were cataloged for the jury. The prosecution's case took a more psychological turn when Dr. Elena Vasquez was called to testify about Theo's motive and mental state. A forensic psychologist who had reviewed the evidence but had not personally evaluated the defendant, as Theo's legal team had declined to make him available for examination. Dr. Vasquez offered expert insight into how childhood trauma can manifest in behavioral patterns. Based on my review of the defendant's history and the evidence in this case, what we appear to be seeing is a phenomenon known as transferential rage, she explained, addressing the jury directly. This occurs when an individual who has experienced profound rejection or abandonment transfers their anger from the original source, in this case the defendant's mother, to symbolic representatives of what they've been denied. Dr. Vasquez continued by analyzing the significance of Halloween as the date of the murders, theorizing that the holiday's emphasis on family and community participation could have served as a psychological trigger for Theo. Holidays that celebrate family cohesion often create acute distress in children who lack stable family connections, she testified. For a child who has been repeatedly rejected and moved between multiple foster homes, watching other families engage in these celebrations can provoke intense feelings of exclusion, envy, and ultimately rage. This explanation of motive, while not excusing the violence, provided the jury with a framework for understanding how a 14-year-old could develop and act upon such destructive impulses. The most emotionally charged testimony came from Denise Calloway, Theo's social worker, for the 18 months preceding the murders. Calloway, a woman in her early 40s with evident exhaustion etched into her face, spoke of her caseload of over 30 children that had limited her ability to provide the intensive support Theo clearly needed. I observed concerning behaviors, she admitted, visibly struggling with her sense of professional responsibility and potential failure. Theo had a pattern of becoming withdrawn and sometimes hostile after witnessing family interactions, particularly at school events where parents were present. She described an incident 6 months before the murders when Theo had become inconsolable after watching a father teaching his son to ride a bike in a park, refusing to speak for days afterward, and eventually running away from his then-current foster placement. Campbell guided Calloway through her documentation of Theo's history, building a picture of escalating distress that the system had noted but failed to address adequately. Did you make recommendations for specialized therapeutic interventions for Theo based on these observations? The prosecutor asked. Calloway nodded, tears forming in her eyes as she replied, I requested intensive trauma-focused therapy and placement in a specialized therapeutic foster home on 3 separate occasions. Due to funding limitations and placement shortages, these recommendations were never implemented. This testimony served the prosecution's narrative that while Theo's trauma was real, the system had recognized his needs and attempted to address them, placing responsibility for the failure to receive treatment back on the defendant's refusal to engage with the limited services that were available. During cross-examination, Rivera used Calloway's testimony to strengthen the defense's portrayal of systemic failure. Ms. Calloway, what is the recommended caseload for a social worker handling complex cases involving severely traumatized children? She asked. When Calloway responded that best practices suggested no more than 15 cases, Rivera continued, and you were handling twice that number, correct? Making it physically impossible to provide the level of supervision and support these vulnerable children required? Calloway's affirmative response shifted some of the responsibility from Theo himself to the underfunded and overwhelmed system that had failed to protect both him and ultimately his victims. The most unexpected moment in the prosecution's case came when they called Raymond Powell, Theo's foster father, at the time of the murders. Powell, a solidly built man with a gentle demeanor that seemed at odds with his physical presence, took the stand with visible reluctance, his gaze briefly meeting Theo's before focusing on the prosecutor. Theo was different from other foster children we've had, he testified, his hands clasped tightly together. Not in a way that seemed dangerous, quite the opposite. He was extraordinarily polite, always helpful around the house, never caused any problems that would raise red flags. Campbell skillfully guided Powell through his observations of Theo's behavior in the weeks leading up to Halloween, establishing that while the teenager had seemed increasingly withdrawn, there had been no outbursts or concerning incidents that would have alerted the Powells to the potential for violence. He asked to go trick-or-treating with us and the other kids, Powell recalled, his voice catching slightly. Then the morning of Halloween, he said he wasn't feeling well and wanted to stay home. We never imagined— He paused, collecting himself before continuing. We never imagined he was planning something like this. There were no signs, nothing that would have warned us. This testimony served a crucial function for the prosecution, countering the defense's narrative that Theo's trauma was so obvious and his needs so clear that the violence could have been prevented with proper intervention. Instead, it suggested that Theo had developed the capacity to conceal his intentions and present a facade of normalcy, behaviors that implied a level of premeditation and awareness that contradicted claims of diminished capacity. The impact on the jury was evident, with several members looking at Theo with newly troubled expressions, seeing not just a damaged child, but someone capable of deliberate deception. The most technically complex testimony came from digital forensics expert Maya Ortiz, who had analyzed Theo's school-issued laptop and presented findings that strongly supported the prosecution's theory of premeditation. In the 6 weeks preceding the murders, the defendant conducted multiple searches related to the Harris family, she testified, displaying a timeline of Theo's internet activity. He accessed Jessica Harris's public social media accounts 27 times, viewed the family's vacation photos, and specifically looked at posts mentioning their Halloween plans. Ortiz also presented evidence that Theo had searched for information about metal pipes as weapons, effects of blunt force trauma, and methods for removing fingerprints from various surfaces, searches that directly connected to the method and means of the murders. As the prosecution approached the conclusion of its case, they called their final witness, Dr. Samuel Becker, a renowned child psychiatrist who specialized in juvenile violence. Dr. Becker, with his distinguished gray beard and bow tie that seemed almost anachronistic in the modern courtroom, provided expert testimony on the crucial question of whether Theo, despite his age and history of trauma, understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. Based on my review of the evidence, including the defendant's internet searches, his apparent planning of the crime, his efforts to conceal evidence afterward, and his statements during interrogation, it is my professional opinion that he did possess the capacity to understand what he was doing and that it was wrong, Dr. Becker testified. The psychiatrist went further, addressing the central question that hung over the proceedings: how a child could commit such an act. Childhood trauma, while significant and deeply damaging, does not automatically negate moral understanding or behavioral control, he explained, his tone measured but firm. Many children with histories of severe trauma and attachment disruption, similar to the defendant's, never commit violent acts. What we see in this case is not just the presence of trauma, but specific distortions in thinking that the defendant appears to have developed, particularly the belief that families like the Harrises somehow represented an injustice to him personally, rather than simply having what he lacked through no fault of their own. During cross-examination, Rivera challenged Dr. Becker's conclusions, pointing out that he had not personally evaluated Theo and was basing his opinions on document review rather than clinical assessment. Doctor, would you agree that a full understanding of a 14-year-old's mental state would require direct evaluation, particularly when that child has experienced the level of trauma documented in my client's history? She asked. Dr. Becker acknowledged this limitation, but stood by his conclusions, creating a small opening for the defense's upcoming case while leaving the prosecution's narrative largely intact, that Theo Robertson, despite his youth and traumatic background, had made a deliberate choice to commit violence against a family that symbolized everything he had been denied in his own life. As the prosecution rested its case, the atmosphere in the Miami courtroom was heavy with the weight of the evidence presented. Through fingerprints, blood analysis, digital forensics, and expert testimony, they had built a compelling case, not just that Theo had committed the murders, but that he had done so with awareness and intent that warranted the adult charges he faced. Judge Ramirez called a 3-day recess before the defense would begin its case, giving jurors a brief respite from the intense emotional and intellectual demands of the trial while allowing both legal teams to prepare for what promised to be an equally challenging second phase of the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, as Miami's relentless sun beat down on the gathered media and spectators, public opinion remained deeply divided. Some saw Theo as a monster who had hidden in plain sight, while others viewed him as a child failed by every adult and system that should have protected him. Both perspectives contained elements of truth that the judicial system, with its binary framework of guilty or not guilty, would struggle to fully reconcile, a complexity that mirrored the defendant himself, simultaneously a child victim of profound trauma and the perpetrator of horrific violence that had destroyed a family and shaken a community to its core. After 14 days of testimony and evidence presentation, the fate of Theo Robertson rested with the 12 Miami residents who had been sequestered throughout the trial, isolated from the media frenzy and public debate that had engulfed the city. The jury had listened to 32 witnesses, reviewed over 200 pieces of evidence, and absorbed complex testimony, ranging from forensic fingerprint analysis to psychological theories of childhood trauma and attachment disorder. Now, as they filed into the jury room for deliberations, their faces reflected the gravity of the decision before them, whether to convict a 14-year-old of first-degree murder and effectively end any chance of his eventual reintegration into society. The courthouse hallways hummed with tense energy as the various parties to the case positioned themselves for what could be hours or even days of waiting. The Harris family's relatives gathered in a private room provided by the Victim Services Division, supported by counselors and victim advocates who had been with them throughout the grueling trial. Detective Gabriel Martin paced the corridor outside courtroom 3B, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain after weeks of testimony that had forced him to relive the crime scene he had processed on Halloween night. Prosecutor Victoria Campbell sat in the empty courtroom reviewing her notes, mentally preparing for either a swift conviction or the possibility of a deadlocked jury unable to reconcile the defendant's age with the severity of his crimes. In a small consultation room on the courthouse's third floor, defense attorney Monica Rivera sat with Theo, attempting to prepare him for the various possible outcomes. The jury could come back very quickly or take several days, she explained, watching for any reaction from her young client. Either way, it's important that you remain calm when we hear the verdict, regardless of what it is. Theo nodded slightly, his expression as unreadable as it had been throughout the trial, giving Rivera little insight into whether he fully comprehended the life-altering consequences that hung in the balance. Throughout the proceedings, Theo had remained a cipher, present physically but emotionally absent, occasionally whispering questions or comments to Rivera, but otherwise showing no visible reaction to even the most damning testimony against him. Miami's subtropical December heat pressed against the courthouse windows as the hours of deliberation stretched on, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the marble floors of the building's grand hallways. Reporters maintained their vigil on the courthouse steps, broadcasting live updates that essentially communicated that there were no updates. The cable news cycle's demand for constant content, creating a recursive loop of speculation about what might be happening behind the closed doors of the jury room. Legal analysts filled airtime by debating the strengths and weaknesses of both cases, with particular focus on whether the defense had successfully established reasonable doubt about Theo's capacity to understand his actions, given his age and history of trauma. At 4:37 p.m., after just 4 hours and 22 minutes of deliberation, a remarkably short time for a case of this complexity and severity, the jury signaled they had reached a verdict. The news rippled through the courthouse with electric speed, sending court officers scrambling to notify Judge Ramirez, summon the attorneys, and prepare for the heightened security required for the verdict announcement. Within 30 minutes, courtroom 3B had filled to capacity, with the atmosphere so tense it seemed to compress the air itself. The Harris family entered together, a group of 15 relatives supporting each other physically and emotionally, as they took their seats, their collective grief palpable, even after the weeks that had passed since the murders. Theo was led into the courtroom by 2 sheriff's deputies, the standard protocol modified slightly in recognition of his age, with the officers positioning themselves to maintain necessary security while being less visibly restrictive than they would with an adult defendant. He walked with the awkward gait of early adolescence, the 2 large suits still hanging from his thin frame, making him appear even younger than his 14 years. As he took his seat beside Rivera, several jurors glanced in his direction, their expressions inscrutable, but their brief attention suggesting the central difficulty of their task, reconciling the youth before them with the horrific acts described in testimony. Judge Ramirez entered the courtroom last, her robes flowing behind her, as she moved with dignified purpose to the bench. After calling the court to order, she instructed the gallery on proper decorum during the verdict announcement, emphasizing that emotional outbursts would not be tolerated regardless of the outcome. "I understand the profound emotional weight of this case for everyone involved," she acknowledged, her gaze moving deliberately from the Harris family to Theo and back to the packed gallery. "However, this court will maintain order and dignity throughout these proceedings, particularly at this critical moment." When the jury filed in, their faces were uniformly solemn, several showing signs of having been recently crying. The foreman, a middle-aged high school teacher who had been selected by his peers to speak for the group, clutched the verdict form with visibly trembling hands. Judge Ramirez asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreman's "Yes, Your Honor" came as a barely audible response that nonetheless seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. The form was passed to the court clerk, who handed it to the judge for review before it was returned to the clerk for the official reading. In the case of the state of Florida versus Theo Robertson on the count of murder in the first degree of Kevin Harris, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty, the clerk announced, her voice clear but devoid of emotion. Similar verdicts followed for the murders of Jessica and Mason Harris, each guilty landing like a physical blow in the courtroom, despite being widely anticipated given the strength of the evidence. As the third and final verdict was read, the one concerning 8-year-old Mason, a single sob escaped from the Harris family section, quickly muffled but audible enough to momentarily draw all eyes away from Theo. Throughout the verdict reading, Theo remained motionless, his expression unchanged from the impassive mask he had worn throughout the trial. The only visible reaction came not from him, but from his attorney, Monica Rivera, who closed her eyes briefly at each guilty pronouncement, her shoulders seeming to take on additional weight with each count. When the reading concluded, she placed her hand gently on Theo's shoulder, a gesture of support that he neither acknowledged nor rejected, his gaze fixed on some middle distance, as if the proceedings concerned someone else entirely. Judge Ramirez thanked the jury for their service before addressing the schedule for sentencing, which she set for 3 weeks later to allow time for the preparation of pre-sentencing reports and impact statements. As the court officers prepared to lead Theo back to the juvenile detention facility, where he would remain until sentencing, Rivera requested a moment to confer with her client. The judge granted this request, and the attorney bent close to Theo, speaking in a whisper that no one else could hear. Whatever she said elicited no visible response from the teenager, who stood when instructed and allowed himself to be led from the courtroom without looking back at the gallery or the jury that had just determined his fate. The reaction to the verdict played out on multiple stages simultaneously, in the courtroom itself, in the media encampment outside the courthouse, and across Miami's diverse communities. Within moments of the verdict announcement, the Harris family was escorted to a private room where they embraced each other in a complex mixture of relief, grief, and the particular exhaustion that comes from weeks of emotional suspension. Kevin Harris's brother James, who had served as the family's spokesperson throughout the ordeal, emerged briefly to make a statement to the waiting press, his voice steady despite his evident emotion. Today's verdict cannot bring back Kevin, Jessica, and Mason, nor can it heal the void their absence has created in our lives, he told the assembled reporters, cameras flashing against the golden light of Miami's late afternoon sun. We are grateful to the jury for their service, to the prosecution team for their dedication, and to the Miami community for their support during this unimaginable time. James Harris specifically avoided commenting on Theo himself or the appropriate sentence, focusing instead on honoring the memory of his brother's family and requesting privacy as they continued to navigate their grief. Outside the courthouse, the public reaction reflected the divisions that had characterized discussion of the case since its beginning. A group of victims' rights advocates held signs supporting the verdict and calling for the maximum possible sentence, while across the street, juvenile justice reformers staged a counter-demonstration, arguing that the conviction of a 14-year-old as an adult represented a failure of both compassion and rehabilitation principles. The two groups maintained a respectful distance from each other, their competing perspectives creating a visual representation of the broader societal debate about how to handle juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes. Within Miami's foster care community, the verdict prompted a more nuanced response, with foster parents, social workers, and advocates expressing a complex mixture of horror at the crimes, sympathy for both the victims and the perpetrator, and frustration with a system that had failed to adequately address Theo's trauma before it manifested in violence. Candlelight vigils were held simultaneously in different parts of the city, one honoring the Harris family in Coconut Grove near their home, another at the headquarters of a children's advocacy organization focused on systemic reform to better support traumatized youth in the foster care system. In the days following the verdict, media analysis of the case expanded beyond the specifics of the crimes to broader questions about juvenile justice, mental health resources, and the long-term consequences of childhood trauma. National news programs featured panels of experts discussing whether Theo's case represented an aberration or a warning sign about inadequate support systems for vulnerable children. Op-eds in the Miami Herald ranged from calls for harsher juvenile sentencing to pleas for more funding for preventative mental health services, with the case serving as a focal point for larger debates about social policy and criminal justice. Detective Gabriel Martin, speaking to reporters after the verdict, expressed the complicated emotions many law enforcement officials felt about the case. "There's no satisfaction in this outcome," he admitted. The lines in his face deepened by weeks of stress. "As a detective, I'm relieved that the evidence was clear enough for justice to be served for the Harris family. As a human being and a father, I'm profoundly troubled by what this case reveals about our collective failure to protect both the victims of this crime and, in a different way, the young perpetrator, who clearly needed intervention long before that Halloween night. For the jurors now released from their sequestration and free to return to their lives, the experience had been transformative in ways they were only beginning to process. Several declined to speak to the media, citing the emotional toll of the case, while others provided limited comments that revealed the weight of their deliberations. "We didn't take this lightly," one juror told a local news station, requesting anonymity. "We considered his age, his background, everything the defense presented about trauma. But ultimately, the evidence of planning, of deliberate action, we couldn't ignore that, regardless of his age." Monica Rivera held a brief press conference after consulting with Theo, announcing their intention to appeal the verdict on several grounds, including questions about whether a 14-year-old could truly be tried as an adult, given current neuroscientific understanding of adolescent brain development. "Today's verdict represents not justice, but our collective failure as a society to protect our most vulnerable children," she stated, visibly emotional, but maintaining her professional composure. Theo Robertson was failed by his mother, failed by the foster care system, and now failed by the criminal justice system, which has chosen to discard a 14-year-old child rather than confront the difficult work of healing and rehabilitation. In the juvenile detention facility where Theo awaited sentencing, staff reported no change in his behavior or demeanor following the verdict. He returned to his daily routine, attending the facility's school classes, participating in required group activities, and spending his free time reading or drawing in his room. Unlike many juveniles facing severe sentences, he did not act out, become depressed, or seek additional support from staff counselors. This emotional flatness, which had been noted throughout his case, continued to trouble those responsible for his care, reinforcing the complex psychological picture that had emerged during trial of a child so profoundly damaged by early trauma and abandonment that even his own fate seemed disconnected from his emotional reality. As Miami prepared for the sentencing hearing that would determine exactly how the verdict would translate into punishment for Theo Robertson, the city remained divided on what justice truly meant in a case where the perpetrator was simultaneously a child victim of systemic failure and the person responsible for a brutal triple homicide that had destroyed a beloved family. The legal question had been answered with the jury's verdict, but the moral, ethical, and social questions raised by the case continued to reverberate through courtrooms, classrooms, living rooms, and legislative chambers. Questions about childhood trauma, responsibility, and redemption that defied simple resolution. The sentencing hearing for Theo Robertson was scheduled for January 17, 2025, nearly 3 months after the Halloween night murders that had forever altered the landscape of countless lives across Miami. The intervening weeks had seen a flurry of legal filings, pre-sentencing interviews, psychological evaluations, and impact statements, all building toward the moment when Judge Eleanor Ramirez would decide what punishment was appropriate for a 14-year-old convicted of triple homicide. The courthouse, which had briefly returned to its normal rhythms after the verdict, once again became the focal point of intense public attention as Miami's residents, divided on so many aspects of the case, found common ground in their collective holding of breath, waiting to learn what consequences awaited the youngest defendant ever tried as an adult in the city's modern history. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements, a profoundly moving procession of grief that left few in the courtroom unmoved. Kevin Harris's parents, both in their 70s and visibly diminished by their loss, spoke of a son who had overcome humble beginnings to become a doctor, dedicated to serving children in need. He believed every child deserved care and compassion, Kevin's father stated, his voice wavering but determined. Even now, knowing what we know, I believe he would have shown compassion to the young man who took his life. That was who our son was. This remarkable statement, offering a glimpse of grace amid unimaginable pain, created a palpable shift in the courtroom's atmosphere, a momentary transcendence of the adversarial nature of the proceedings. Jessica Harris's sister delivered a statement that humanized the slain teacher through small, intimate details. Her collection of children's artwork saved from every class she had taught, her handwritten notes of encouragement hidden in her husband's lunch container, her annual tradition of making personalized bookmarks for each of her students on their birthdays. Jessica lived to nurture potential, her sister said through tears. She would have wanted even her death to somehow serve that purpose, to help us see the importance of nurturing all children, including those like the defendant who never received the care they needed. This sentiment, echoing the complex empathy expressed by Kevin's father, suggested that the Harris family, even in their devastation, recognized the broader societal failures that had contributed to their tragedy. The most difficult impact statement came from Mason's maternal grandmother, who spoke not only of her grandson's bright spirit and limitless potential, but of the particular horror of child loss that had been inflicted on her daughter and son-in-law in their final moments. "No parent should have to witness their child being harmed," she said, gripping the podium so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I am haunted not just by Mason's death, but by knowing that Jessica and Kevin died carrying that unbearable knowledge that they could not protect their son." At this, several jurors who had returned to observe the sentencing openly wept, and even Judge Ramirez briefly removed her glasses to wipe her eyes, a rare display of emotion from a judge known for her stoic demeanor. Following the impact statements, Prosecutor Victoria Campbell presented the state's sentencing recommendation, arguing that despite Theo's age, the premeditated nature of the crimes and their extreme brutality warranted the maximum possible penalty. The state acknowledges the defendant's youth and troubled background, Campbell stated, her tone measured but firm. However, these factors must be balanced against the deliberate planning evidenced in this case and the taking of 3 innocent lives, including that of an 8-year-old child. She requested consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the maximum allowed under Florida law for a defendant Theo's age, arguing that the consecutive structure appropriately reflected the individual value of each victim's life. Defense attorney Monica Rivera then presented her sentencing argument, focusing on brain development research, rehabilitation potential, and the systemic failures that had preceded the violence. Your Honor, the defendant before you today is not the person he will be at 20 or 30 or 40, she argued passionately. Neuroscience has established beyond question that the adolescent brain, particularly the areas responsible for impulse control, consequence evaluation, and emotional regulation, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. Rivera introduced statements from leading researchers in adolescent development supporting the position that juvenile offenders, even those who commit serious crimes, have significantly higher potential for rehabilitation than adult offenders. Rivera also presented a comprehensive alternative sentencing proposal that included placement in a specialized juvenile facility with intensive trauma-focused therapy until age 21, followed by transfer to adult supervision with regular evaluation and the possibility of eventual release under lifetime supervision if specific rehabilitation benchmarks were met. This approach acknowledges the severity of the crimes while recognizing both the developmental reality of adolescence and our society's moral obligation not to permanently discard a child, no matter how terrible their actions, she concluded, returning to her seat beside Theo, who had maintained the same impassive expression throughout both the victim statements and the arguments about his fate. Before announcing her decision, Judge Ramirez addressed Theo directly, asking if he wished to make a statement to the court. This moment, the first opportunity for the defendant to speak publicly since his arrest, created a tense hush in the courtroom. Theo rose slowly, his posture uncertain in the way characteristic of early adolescence, his voice, when it finally came, startling in its youth and slight tremor. "I know what I did was wrong," he began, the words emerging haltingly, as if each required separate consideration. "I can't explain why I did it, not really. I was angry all the time, and seeing what they had, it made me feel like I couldn't breathe." This halting beginning gave way to a statement that, while brief, provided the first direct glimpse into Theo's internal experience. "I think about them every day. I think about the little boy most of all. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything. I know nothing fixes what I did." He paused, swallowing visibly before adding, "I didn't think about them as real people that night. They were just what I couldn't have. I understand now that they were real people with real lives. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't help anyone." With these words, the most emotion he had displayed throughout the entire legal process, Theo sat down, his eyes briefly meeting those of the Harris family members, before returning to their habitual middle-distance focus. Judge Ramirez then delivered her sentencing decision, beginning with an acknowledgment of the complexity of the case before her. "The court is tasked with an extraordinarily difficult balance in this matter," she stated, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "On one hand, we have 3 innocent lives taken with violence that can only be described as extreme. On the other, we have a defendant who is 14 years old at the time of these crimes, with a documented history of severe trauma and systemic neglect." She detailed the factors she had considered, the premeditation evident in Theo's actions, his age and developmental stage, the victim impact statements, the relevant case law regarding juvenile sentencing, and the broader societal interests of justice, punishment, and rehabilitation. After this measured preamble, Judge Ramirez's tone shifted to one of unmistakable finality as she delivered her sentence. Theo Robertson, having been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 3 counts of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment. A murmur ran through the courtroom at the consecutive nature of the sentences, effectively ensuring that Theo would never be released regardless of any future changes in parole laws. The judge continued, her voice rising slightly to be heard over the reaction. While Florida law requires that a juvenile defendant, such as yourself, be afforded a review of sentencing after 25 years, the consecutive structure of this sentence means that, practically speaking, he will die in prison. The phrase, "he will die in prison," echoed through the courtroom with devastating clarity, spoken loudly and directly at Theo rather than about him in the third person, a deliberate break in judicial protocol that emphasized the finality of the punishment. The judge continued, now addressing the broader implications of the case. This sentence reflects not only the severity of your crimes, but also a recognition that our system failed you long before you failed society. That failure, however profound, cannot excuse or mitigate the deliberate taking of 3 innocent lives. As the sentencing concluded and Theo was led from the courtroom for transport to the juvenile section of a maximum security state prison, the various parties to the case dispersed to process the outcome in their own ways. The Harris family gathered privately with their support network, their grief neither diminished nor resolved by the sentence, but perhaps altered by the knowledge that the legal process had reached its conclusion. Prosecutor Victoria Campbell held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, characterizing the sentence as justice for 3 innocent victims, while acknowledging the tragedy of a 14-year-old facing life imprisonment. Defense attorney Monica Rivera, visibly emotional, announced her immediate intention to appeal both the verdict and the sentence on multiple constitutional grounds. The aftermath of the case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved, rippling outward to affect policy, practice, and public discourse across Florida, and eventually nationwide. Within 6 months of Theo's sentencing, the Florida legislature convened special hearings on the foster care system with particular focus on identifying and providing appropriate interventions for severely traumatized children before they reached crisis points. The Harris Act, named in memory of the murdered family, allocated additional funding for trauma-informed care within the foster system and mandated reduced caseloads for social workers handling high-risk youth with histories of abandonment and attachment disorders. The Miami-Dade School District implemented new training programs for teachers and counselors to better identify warning signs in students experiencing trauma, creating an intervention protocol specifically designed to connect vulnerable children with appropriate mental health resources before behavioral issues escalated to violence. Jessica Harris's former principal spearheaded this initiative, establishing a scholarship in her name for education students committed to trauma-informed teaching practices. The medical center where Kevin Harris had practiced created a specialized clinic serving foster children, providing comprehensive physical and mental health care regardless of insurance status or placement stability. Detective Gabriel Martin, profoundly affected by the case, became an advocate for juvenile justice reform, speaking at police academies about the importance of trauma-informed approaches when dealing with young offenders. In a widely shared speech at a national law enforcement conference, Martin reflected, "The hardest lesson of the Robertson case was recognizing that by the time we became involved, prevention was already impossible. Our challenge as a society is to intervene effectively long before a troubled child becomes the subject of a murder investigation. His perspective, coming from a veteran homicide detective rather than a traditional reform advocate, lent particular credibility to calls for a more nuanced approach to juvenile justice. The media narrative surrounding the case evolved in the months following sentencing, with in-depth investigative reports tracing the systematic failures in Theo's life, from his mother's untreated addiction issues through the numerous missed intervention opportunities during his years in foster care. A nationally broadcast documentary, Before Halloween Night, interviewed Theo's former teachers, social workers, and foster parents, creating a comprehensive timeline of warning signs that had been noted but never adequately addressed. The documentary prompted congressional hearings on the state of child welfare systems nationwide, with experts testifying about the long-term societal costs of inadequate funding for prevention and early intervention services. Theo himself faded from public view as he began serving his sentence, first in the juvenile section of a state prison, and later, after his 18th birthday, in the general adult prison population. Occasional legal filings by Monica Rivera, who continued to represent him through the appeals process, provided brief updates on his status, but these generated decreasing media attention as the years passed and new cases captured public interest. Reports from prison officials described him as a model inmate who participated in available educational programs and caused no disciplinary issues, his behavior inside prison mirroring the compliant exterior he had presented in his foster homes. A young man who followed rules and avoided conflict, but remained fundamentally disconnected from those around him. The Harris family's absence created concentric circles of loss that extended far beyond their immediate relatives. Kevin's pediatric patients were transferred to other doctors, many of whom volunteered extra hours to ensure continuity of care for the children he had served. Jessica's third-grade classroom remained empty for the remainder of that school year, with various substitute teachers attempting to guide her students through both the curriculum and their grief, many of the children attending therapy sessions to process the sudden, violent loss of a teacher they had loved. Mason's empty seat at his soccer team's games became a permanent memorial, with his number retired and a small plaque installed at the field where he had played. 5 years after the murders on Halloween night 2029, the Coconut Grove community gathered for the dedication of Harris Memorial Park, built on the site of the family's former home, which had been purchased by a community foundation after standing empty for years, no family wanting to live where such tragedy had occurred. The park featured a children's library, in Jessica's honor, a medical clinic offering free care to underserved children in Kevin's name, and a playground designed with input from Mason's former classmates, now teenagers themselves. At the dedication ceremony, James Harris, Kevin's brother, spoke about transforming tragedy into positive action. We cannot change what happened here, but we can change what happens next. This space, once defined by violence, will now serve the values my brother, sister-in-law, and nephew lived by: compassion, education, and joy. The case's legal legacy continued to evolve through appeals and changing juvenile justice standards nationally. In 2031, a landmark Supreme Court decision further restricted life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders, citing evolving standards of neuroscience regarding adolescent brain development. This ruling triggered a review of Theo's sentence, though the consecutive nature of his 3 life terms significantly complicated his case compared to others affected by the decision. Legal experts debated whether the ruling's requirement for meaningful opportunity for release could be satisfied when multiple life sentences were served consecutively, creating a complex legal question that would take years to resolve through the courts. By 2035, a decade after sentencing, the public narrative around the case had shifted substantially, with Theo increasingly viewed through the lens of systemic failure rather than individual monstrosity. Academic studies cited the case as a quintessential example of the cascade model of childhood trauma, where each institutional failure compounds the next, creating an increasingly narrow path to healthy development. While this evolving perspective did not excuse or minimize the horror of his crimes, it placed them within a broader context of preventable tragedy, leading to substantive policy reforms that potentially spared other traumatized children from similar paths. For those most intimately connected to the case, the extended Harris family, the police officers and prosecutors who had worked to secure justice, the defense team who had advocated for a child they knew had committed monstrous acts, and the foster care workers who questioned what they might have done differently. The Halloween murders remained a defining life event, a dividing line between before and after. They carried this case with them in different ways, some through advocacy work, others through private grief or professional dedication, all forever altered by their proximity to a tragedy that had begun decades earlier with the abandonment of a child whose wounds had festered until they erupted in violence that created new wounds for countless others. The judge's words at sentencing, "He will die in prison," remained the definitive statement on Theo Robertson's future, a harsh reality unchanged by the evolving discourse around juvenile justice or the growing understanding of trauma's effects on developing brains. This sentence, simultaneously a punishment for unthinkable violence and an indictment of collective societal failure, served as both the conclusion to a specific case and the beginning of a broader reckoning with how communities identify, support, and ultimately bear responsibility for their most vulnerable members before they become their most dangerous. In Miami, Halloween was forever changed, no longer simply a celebration of costumes and candy, but now also an annual reminder of lives lost and lessons learned at terrible cost. Each year, as children in bright costumes walked the streets of Coconut Grove collecting treats, many families made a pilgrimage to Harris Memorial Park, leaving small tributes at the 3 copper plaques that marked the entrance. Remember the past, protect the future. Let compassion guide us forward. These words, chosen by the Harris family, stood as both a memorial to what had been lost and a challenge to prevent such loss from occurring again, a legacy far more complex and enduring than the violence of a single Halloween night.